as I said, this thing is going to be recorded, and the way we're going to break it up is into 20-minute sections. At the end of each 20-minute section or so, there will be time for Q&A. So feel free to voice your opinion or voice your questions, knowing that there is MAAWG confidentiality going on. So this will be limited only to MAAWG members. The rest of the video will be broadcast, will be edited in a format that will be available on the MAAWG website, so you could actually use this for client education as well. And so without further ado, at the far end is Sean Brown. He's with Innovation LLP. He is a lawyer and an expert at Canada's anti-spam law. He has worked at Industry Canada and elsewhere, helping them to get the law together. And he'll be handling the second half of this session, where we'll get really into the nuts and bolts. To begin with, Andre Leduc, who is a senior policy advisor at Industry Canada, which is the government agency that is responsible for the development and implementation of CASL, has been working on this law for as long as I can remember. I think probably about 6 or 7 years. Much to his happiness and all of ours in Canada, this law finally got passed in December. It has huge implications for CAN-SPAM and the way that email is handled in North America, indeed worldwide. And so Andre is going to handle explaining to you the entire history of the making of a spam law. And so I'm going to hand it over to Andre at this point, and he'll take you through it. Have a great session.
Thank you, Neil. We'll run through the session, this part of the session, in just under an hour, including time for questions. What we'll start off with is an overview of the legislation and the next steps regarding when we're going to post the regulations for comment, when we're going to bring the Act into force. Then we'll get into the substantive requirements under Canada's anti-spam legislation, the amendments to the Competition Act, and the amendments to the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act. Following that up, we'll talk a little bit about the 3 agencies responsible for the enforcement of the legislation and the administrative monetary penalty regime that comes with this legislation. When I'm done that, Sean will take over for sections 4 and 5. He'll compare CASL to the CAN-SPAM Act, and he'll be able to do some interpretation of the law and give you a little bit more of practical issues discussion. So what are the goals for the session? Hopefully at the end you'll understand the main requirements under the anti-spam legislation. You'll be able to identify whether or not it applies to you when you're sending or installing. It's hopefully meant to address some of the misconceptions, fears, and concerns that a number of industry members might have. To know what to do if you do make a mistake and you accidentally contravene the legislation. Best practices in terms of going beyond what are the minimum requirements, and then we'll have a facilitated discussion, and hopefully Sean and I will be able to answer your questions. So overview and next steps. Originally, the bill was tabled on April 24th, 2009 as the Electronic Commerce Protection Act. In December of 2009, it died on the order paper when the Canadian Parliament prorogued. It was reintroduced on May 25th of 2010 as the Fighting Internet and Wireless Spam Act. There was a few minor amendments, but basically only the name changed. During the course of committee deliberations, the short title of FISA was removed because it was believed that that was placed there for political reasons. The committee removed the short title, and as such, we have now no name, or we do have a name, it's just 52 words long. We will post the regulations shortly, hopefully at the beginning of July, and have a 60-day consultation period. The CRTC is also responsible for some regulations under their powers under the legislation. They will be posting theirs around the same time frame and consulting via the Canada Gazette as well. So I'm sure Jerry or Neil will send out to the MAAWG membership when we do post the regulations. You can send in a submission with your comments, questions, or suggestions for further regulation to the Government of Canada via that Canada Gazette posting. We will go out for those consultations, and then we will post what is Part 2. Part 2 are the final regulations, and these will come into force at the same time the bill comes into force, which is expected to be late this year or possibly even early 2012. So what is CASL? CASL is standalone legislation and includes amendments to other acts like the Personal Information Protection and Electronic Documents Act, the Competition Act, the Telecommunications Act, and the CRTC Act. CASL is a regulatory regime that is based on the federal trade and commerce power. That said, we can only regulate commercial activity. Non-commercial activity is not covered by this legislation. And now into the meat. There are 6 violations created under this legislation. The first, under Section 6, is the anti-spam clause, and it says no person shall send an unsolicited commercial electronic message. Section 7 is a prohibition against the unauthorized alteration of transmission data. This is designed basically to be a data integrity clause. When you type in, I want to go to bankofamerica.com, you should be routed there and not rerouted to a mock site that looks and smells and feels like bankofamerica.com, but is not bankofamerica.com. So basically, transmission data is all of the data that accompanies the message that is not the message, the time and date which it is sent, the size of the message, the subject line, etc., but does not get into the content of the message. However, if somebody alters that to send it to somewhere where you didn't intend on going, that's picked up in the transmission data and would be considered an unauthorized altering of that transmission data. Section 8 is designed to address malware. Broadly, its statement is you cannot install a computer program without consent. Designed to get at any software, any executable files that are downloaded onto a computer system without the computer system's owner or authorized user's consent. Then under sections, I believe they're 55 and 57 of the legislation, or no, sorry, 75 and 77 of the legislation are amendments to the Competition Act regarding false and misleading information. In a commercial respect, you cannot falsify or mislead people. We've moved beyond what was in the Competition Act for the traditional market into the online realm. And finally, 2 amendments to PIPEDA. The first, dealing with address harvesting and dictionary attacks, is no one is allowed to use a computer system to collect electronic addresses without consent. And lastly, you cannot access a computer system to collect personal information if that access is contrary to an act of Parliament and is unauthorized by the computer system's owners or authorized users. So these are the 6 violations that make up the anti-spam legislation in Canada. Next steps coming down the pipes, as I mentioned earlier, we'll post the regulations to the Canada Gazette, hopefully sometime in early July, and the consultation period will be for 60 days, during which time you can submit through the Canada Gazette to the government your comments and suggestions regarding regulations under Canada's anti-spam legislation. I'll move on into Section 2, start getting into the more interesting details of the regime. So Section 6, a commercial electronic message, applies to any message sent from or accessed by a computer located in Canada. We did this in order to protect Canadians from the bombardment of spam from outside our borders, as well as to protect other nations from being bombarded by Canadian spam. So if there is a Canadian bombarding spam outside of our borders, we may never see it reported within our own borders, but we will likely be receiving complaints from the country, aka it could be France, for example. We'll receive reports and complaints from the French saying there's a likely Canadian spamming them. So this was to maximize the protections for Canadians and Canadian networks that we moved ahead with this kind of a jurisdictional clause. Unlike CAN spam, and Sean will go into some detail about this, but the regime is technology neutral. It covers more than just email. It covers commercial electronic messages sent to electronic addresses over any form of telecommunication. This would include instant messaging, text messaging, social media messaging, and we'll go into some detail on that, but it's social media that is sent to the address, not something that is posted. So whatever you post on your Facebook or you post on your Twitter account, it does not apply under here, except for the Competition Act amendments where you're making a false and misleading representation in a commercial context. Under the legislation currently, voice, live voice, facsimile, and automated dialer recorded message is excluded. This is already covered by Canada's Do Not Call legislation. And unlike other regimes previously seen, there is no minimum number for it to be recognized as spam. Each individual commercial electronic message can constitute a violation of the legislation. Commercial electronic message is broadly defined, and it covers most commercial activity. But basically, the idea here is that if you are offering a product, good, or service for sale in an electronic message, you're promoting a product, good, or service, you're providing a business opportunity, a gaming opportunity, investment opportunity, etc., this would be covered by a commercial electronic message. And the first message sent requesting consent to send further commercial electronic messages is considered a commercial electronic message, therefore it could be considered as a violation of the legislation. There are three fundamental rules to the regime. One, before you send a commercial electronic message, you require some form of consent, either express or implied. You need to identify yourself, the sender, the entity that is represented in the message, and if different, the person who actually sends the message. So if you're sending messages on behalf of United Airlines should be identified, and the company sending the commercial electronic message should be identified. And three, in each and every commercial electronic message sent, you must have a clearly stated, easy to see, unsubscribe link or message or function within the commercial electronic message in every instance, and we'll go into details about what the requirements are for the unsubscribe. There are two broad exemptions. Don't confuse exemptions from exceptions, and we'll go into some detail on those. The next slide talks about exceptions. These are exemptions. All commercial electronic messaging to family, and family will be further defined in the regulations, as will personal relationships. The second group where there is a broad exemption from the legislation, i.e. no requirements, are inquiries or applications regarding the recipient's commercial activity. I contact United Airlines about purchasing one of their tickets. Now, this is a list of exceptions. There is an exception for the requirement to having consent for these messages. However, all of the other rules regarding identification and unsubscribe would apply to these. And they include quotes or estimates, commercial electronic messages that facilitate or finalize a commercial transaction, warranty, guarantee, or safety information, information about ongoing subscriptions or memberships, Book of the Month Club is an example, information related to employee relationships, or commercial electronic messages that actually deliver the good or the service, i.e. you send me the software in a commercial electronic message. There are 4 forms of implied consent under the legislation. It's deemed in 4 circumstances. 1, existing business relationships. We have some kind of a transactional or ongoing business relationship. From the point where that relationship has started, you have a 24-month implied consent period. Complicating factor is for things like subscriptions and memberships, the 24-month period starts at the end of my membership or the end of the subscription. So I subscribe to a magazine for 5 years. At the end of my subscription period, they have 24 months after the 5 years in which to contact me to renew my subscription. Existing non-business relationships are designed for political parties, religious groups, charities. These are non-business entities who wish to send a commercial electronic message. They want to sell a t-shirt, tickets to the circus, etc. They also have a 24-month period from the beginning of the relationship in which to do so. Conspicuous publication is the example I always give, is a dentist posts his email address on his website. Companies within the dental industry can contact that dentist, Colgate, Crest, etc., in an attempt to sell that dentist their products because it relates back to his professional capacity. And Sean will go into some more detail about that later. And lastly, the recipient has disclosed his electronic address to the sender, i.e. business cards. We're at an event today, I hand you my business card. I'm implying consent that you can send me commercial electronic messages. Something that was discussed at great length as we went through the parliamentary and committee process was implying consent for referrals. We had a lot of pressure from the Real Estate Association in Canada, financial advisors, and other professional type service organizations to allow for one individual to imply consent on somebody else's behalf. I want to imply consent on Sean's behalf to have my real estate agent send Sean a commercial electronic message. The government, the committee, did not allow for this in the legislation, so you cannot imply or infer consent on somebody else's behalf. As I noted already, in most cases, implied consent lasts for 2 years. Sometimes that 2 years starts at the end of the relationship, in the case of a subscription or a membership. And within the legislation, we built in, from the coming into force date, those implied relationships will actually have a 36-month time period if they were entered into prior to the coming into force of the legislation. So if you currently have an existing business relationship and the legislation comes into force, you have up to 3 years from coming into force to send a commercial electronic message to that individual. So if you are going to send commercial electronic messages, the first question you have to ask is, am I sending a commercial electronic address? Does Section 6 apply? If I am going to send a commercial electronic message, do I need consent? Do the exemptions or exceptions apply? If you don't have an actual consent, can you rely on implied consent? And if not, how do we go about obtaining consent? Now, in most cases, the framework discussed was you obtain consent via your website, at your bricks and mortar location. The important thing, the most important thing in the legislation is, if you're getting consent, keep a record of consent. If you're doing it over the phone, at the very least, record the transmission data or record the conversation outright. If you're doing it online and people are checking, yes, I want to receive a commercial electronic message from you, keep a record of that transmission data. The burden of proof in all cases for the sending of commercial electronic messages is on the sender. Identification. Legislation specifies that the person sending the message has to identify themselves, and if it is different, the person who is represented in that message must also be identified. So if an ESP is sending on behalf of United Airlines, again, United Airlines should be identified and the sender should be identified. We'll get into more detail in the regulatory package forthcoming about what are the requirements within the contact information. So what is required in contact information? Is it a physical address, business address, etc.? The unsubscribe mechanism must be functional for a period of 60 days, must be made available to the person receiving the message that they can unsubscribe at no additional cost. It has to be done via the same means that the message was sent, unless doing so is impracticable. And by this we mean if you send an email over the internet, I should be able to unsubscribe over the internet. If you send me a text message, I should be able to send back the stop text message to unsubscribe. However, if there are technologies where it's impracticable to do so, you can just include some electronic address or link within the message, some function, possibly even a 1-800 number, so that I can go and unsubscribe from these messages. You must exercise the person's wish to unsubscribe without delay, but in no event, no greater than 10 business days. Originally, we had in there 10 business days as a period where you could provide or exercise the unsubscribe, but people were starting to think that I had a 10-day period in which to send more commercial electronic messages. That is not the case. The idea was for small and medium-sized businesses who don't regularly check their lists to give them a period that they'd only have to do it every 10 days. But now it says it's without delay. So before you send out your next set of commercial electronic messages, make sure that the unsubscribes have been given effect to. Defining sent. The message counts as a commercial electronic message being sent once its transmission has been initiated. Whether or not it arrives at its destination, or whether or not it gets pinged back is immaterial. If you're doing a dictionary attack on gmail.com, every initiated commercial electronic message, whether or not it actually goes to a mailbox, falls under the legislation. Competition Act amendments prohibit false or misleading representations in a commercial context, i.e. cureforcancer.com, etc. Included under these prohibitions are the subject line, the sender info, the locators, or the contents of the message. So you cannot have a false and misleading representation in a commercial context in any aspect of a commercial electronic message or on a website. Materiality only applies to the content of a message. So if I do have a commercial electronic message that says, save the planet, I can't put that alone in the subject line. I have to quantify that. Because are you actually saving the planet by using an environmentally friendly vehicle, an electronic or hybrid vehicle? That's the idea behind the materiality, is those statements in the headers, i.e., or a URL or the subject line, do not need to be proved that you have made this false or misleading representation in a material respect. And something to note, we'll get into the private right of action a little bit later, but the private right of action does apply to these provisions. Amendments to the Personal Information Protection Electronic Documents Act removes the ability to rely on exemptions for address harvesting. A program like FFA, Free for All, which goes out there and searches the internet for the @ symbol and downloads the content on either side. That activity is prohibited, as are dictionary attacks. I mentioned the Gmail idea before. I tried 2 billion variants in front of gmail.com. This would count as a dictionary attack. The pinging of the mail servers can be a great cost burden to those hosting these mail servers when they undergo a dictionary attack. It's constant pinging of that mail server over and over and over again to the tune of 2 billion times can really slow down the mail service provided. It also, as I mentioned earlier, prohibits the unauthorized collection of personal information via access to a computer system that is done contrary to an existing act of Parliament. I can't hack into Sony's computer systems to collect the personal information of 77 million users.